Hi guys, and welcome back to Elevate Legal. And my name's Raul. I've been part of the team that's been bringing you the legal series so far, so I really hope you've been getting something out of it. In today's video, we're going to be having a look at memory tips and how to memorize things specifically for the legal studies exam. So we're going to cover a few different techniques. The first is note-taking, consistency and structure, review, night listening, practice papers, syllabus, and the flow. And we're going to apply all of these techniques to an example where I show you how I memorized human rights when I went through the HSC. So let's get right into it. The first thing we're going to talk about is note-taking, which really is the crux of where your memorization begins. Obviously, if you have no notes to memorize, then learning all these techniques really doesn't apply. So the first thing I want to talk to you about is reading before you write. I think because legal studies is such a content-heavy exam, there's a large temptation to save yourself some time and type notes as you read the textbook. Now, what I'm recommending you do is read a section of the textbook, whatever section you're trying to take notes on, before you actually take notes. Now, what this will let you do is let you understand the topic that you're writing notes about generally, which means you can then pick out specific things to write down, which will, of course, save you words. And that is the goal here. We want to try and get our notes down to the most condensed form that they can be while still containing all of the critical information that we need. Whereas, so if you read your textbook as you write notes, what you'll tend to do is copy out sentences, entire sentences that sound really nice, things that you might not need because you haven't read all the way to the end to get a real understanding of what that particular paragraph or page or even topic in the book is trying to tell you. So that's just a really quick tip in terms of your note-taking. And it's generally aimed at saving you time, right? And that time would be far better spent on making sure your notes are structured well and are consistently doing things that will increase your memory of them. So let's get right into looking at that as well. Consistency and structure. So the first thing is that visual memory is your most powerful form of memory, right? And we like to do this sort of test in seminars that we run all the time. If we gave you a bunch of words, a bunch of numbers, and a picture to memorize, you'd find that pretty much 100% of the time, your brain is going to be able to remember and regurgitate that picture far more easily than the numbers or words. So visual memory is certainly something that we should be trying to tap into. So that's why I recommend you use color, bolding, italics, and other formatting options as much as possible in your notes, and more importantly, use them consistently. Now, what I mean by using them consistently is that keep one set of color, one set of bolding, one set of italics to mean a different thing, and use it throughout your notes, not only in legal studies, but in every subject. And what that'll mean is that your brain will automatically start to associate that color or that formatting option with a particular type of thing, which is really good. So you're starting to build this structure in your memory, in your visual memory, where one thing visually relates to another. And that's exactly how you're going to get the most out of your notes. And what ties in with that, specifically, is to keep your structure strict. Which will make your life a lot easier. It'll make your brain thank you because it'll let your brain sort of memorize things in chunks where they belong within the structure and within the syllabus. Now, I understand that sounds really vague, so I have included an example. This is a set of notes that I prepared, and it sort of shows you everything that I was just talking about. So the very first thing I'll talk about is the color and formatting options. As you can see on the left-hand side there's a lot of red. Red in my notes meant cases. So you can see at the top there's R.V. Thomas Sam, there's R.V. Morgan, and it's all in red. On the right-hand side, you can see at the top of the page there's the Crimes Act, which is in green, that's legislation, and there's blue towards the bottom, and that was sources. So that's just the colors that I happen to choose for my notes. But what I really wanted to draw your attention to is sort of the level here. So going back to the cases, you can see that the title of the cases are bolded, and then the non-title, the explanation, is not in bold. Similarly, legislation is in italics, and over here, with the sources in blue, the title is again bold, the explanation is not. So it's just building this level where my brain starts to realize that when it sees things in bold, that's really critical information that it wants to remember. When it sees bold red, it knows it's a case, so it can sort of file it away in the case section. The second thing I want to draw your attention to is the structure. On the left-hand side, we'll go over to page 3, the left-hand side. At the top of the page, it says strict liability offences. That's a direct syllabus stop point. So it's in sort of all capital letters, underlined. The next one down is causation. Again, a direct syllabus dot point, all in capitals, underlined. Over on the right-hand side, offences against the person, if you go and look at the legal studies syllabus, has sort of multiple dot points within it. So here, offences against the person, the very first dot point within it is homicide, and within homicide is murder. So you can see how very clearly there's a structure here where within one dot point is another, and then within that dot point is another, and you can see it's all indented. And then within murder, there's 3 more points where I've got the source, the case, and an explanation of what I've put there. So this really helps your brain segregate things. Rather than just a wall of text, your brain is starting to group things into bits of information where it belongs. And that's really going to be useful when you come to try and memorize it. So we'll push on. The next thing is review. So because legal studies, like I said, is so content heavy, cramming generally won't help you. You won't be able to learn that much information the night before the exam, I'm sorry to say. But what you can do is just review your notes every month. And reviewing doesn't have to be anything more than just sitting down and reading them. And realistically, a month's worth of notes is never going to take you more than an hour to read. So all you do is one Sunday every month or just one day every month, sit down, print them off, and read through your notes. That's literally all you have to do. And because of the color and the structure that you've got in them, you'll start to automatically memorize those things just by reading them every single month. Because the next month, when you come to read that same information, you'll start to be able to guess sort of what's coming next. And by the end of the year, if you do this for the whole year, you're going to have a really, really good knowledge of where everything is in your notes and what your structure means. And that information isn't going into your short-term memory, it's going into your long-term memory, which, as I put here, is more than definitely your best friend. And there's a very simple reason for that. If you cram and if you put things into your short-term memory, it means that when the next exam comes along, you have to do it all over again and waste more time. Whereas if you sit down 1 hour every month and review your notes and put stuff into your long-term memory, the only thing you'll have to do is make short-term summaries to refresh yourself of specifics directly before an exam, which means you leave yourself to spend more of your time on more important things like practice papers. Another technique that I really like to use, particularly for the longer type of memorization stuff, such as essays, is something I like to call night listening. Now, pretty much all I did was record myself speaking my essays, and I listened to them at night when I was going to sleep, or sometimes on the train to an exam, or if I was out for a run, or something that I was doing where I had some spare time and I just wanted my brain to sort of just absorb things in the background. Now, there's a couple of really awesome benefits to night listening. The first is that when you speak out your essay and when you listen to it back, you will automatically be able to detect where it doesn't flow, any bits of the essay that it is wrong, anything that sounds just really out of place, and you'll be able to fix those mistakes really quickly. So it's actually going to improve the quality of your work. Not only that, but as you listen to it more and more, it will just naturally become more and more familiar. In the same way that as we review our notes, we can start to guess what's going to come next, the next month. The more we listen to our essay, we can start to guess what's going to be in the next paragraph, what's going to be in the next sentence, etc., until you know it pretty much word for word. And even just after a few times listening to it, you'll know it at least in the ideas and exactly what it's trying to say. And that's critical going into an exam. The next point I want to make is practice papers, and I really hope that you've heard this point a million times by now because it is one of the most important things you can do. I'm going to be focusing on it from a memory aspect, but there's obviously a wealth of benefits to doing practice papers. From a memory point of view, in terms of essays and the human rights section, they're quite easily memorized because essays are a block of text, you can learn them in sentence form, and human rights, at the end of today's video, I'm going to show you how to learn that section. The crime section, on the other hand, is far more specific and far more content heavy, which makes it very hard to memorize in its entirety. And this is where practice papers can be something that's really, really beneficial. So combining practice papers with a good set of notes and doing the practice papers with your notes next to you gives you a massive, massive boost in memory retention. First of all, it'll get you knowing where everything is in your notes again because you have to use them to answer questions. Secondly, it'll give you lots of experience in applying your notes to actual answers in papers. And thirdly, it will just increase your general and specific retention of your content that's in your notes because you're literally writing it out again and applying it and answering multiple choice questions and doing things like that over and over again. So practice papers are definitely a really good way to get your content under control. Now we come to what I think is probably the most important of any of the points I'm going to make today. It's understanding the syllabus and understanding the flow of the syllabus. So the syllabus is another best friend. It really is your rule book to legal studies and to all of the subjects that you're going to sit in your exams. It tells you everything that can be examined. And the best thing about legal studies is that it's a very cumulative subject. So what I mean by that is that one thing builds on another, which means that all the topics flow together really well. And if you can understand that flow from the syllabus, that means that in your brain, your memory of the syllabus and your memory of the content associated with the syllabus will increase exponentially. So the flow gives you your strict structure to your notes, and it gives you a strict structure in your brain. And we're going to have a look at this in the human rights content, in the human rights example rather, because what it's going to show you is that you not only can you learn the content and what the content says, but you can also learn where the content fits together. And that is just as important, because it's one thing knowing all the answers, but it's another thing being able to fit all those answers together into a comprehensive answer. So without further ado, we are going to have a look at an example. All right, so what I've got up here is Microsoft Paint and the HSC syllabus for the human rights section. And what I'm going to start by doing in this example is showing you exactly how I identify the flow in the syllabus. So the way that I start is always looking at the major things in the syllabus. So not the specific dot points per se, but the very first thing I like to look at is the sort of topic heading. So the first one here is the nature and development of human rights. The second one is promoting and enforcing human rights. And the third one is a contemporary issue, which of course will be different for all of you depending on what you choose to study. So even just thinking about that sort of on a logical level away from the specifics of legal studies, that flow naturally makes sense. The very first thing we look at is the nature of human rights and how they even came about. The second thing we look at is, okay, now that they are in existence, how do we promote them and how do we enforce them? And then the third thing we look at is a contemporary and specific example of those human rights in action today. So that overarching flow is very, very important. And if you understand that for each element of your syllabus, you'll find that you can write essays and answers very, very easily. Because a question might ask you a specific element of the flow. It might ask you about the entire flow. It might ask you about just one element of one part of the flow. So it might ask you just about the development of human rights or the developing recognition, which is here. And at all stages, no matter what question you get, understanding how that content relates to other content will let you show the examiner you've put more work in and therefore deserve more marks. So for example, if you get a question asking about the nature and development of human rights, and you write entirely about the nature and development of human rights, how it came about, everything that happened, that's a great answer. And if you throw in one sentence at the end that says how that relates to the other content, such as promoting and enforcing, so how the development of human rights has sort of lent to the fact that now they lack enforcement or they have enforcement powers in these aspects, or even just one sentence at the end of your answer, that automatically pushes your answer into sort of the band 6 range, because a marker's looking at that and going, wow, not only have they understood the question, not only have they answered it really thoroughly, they've really thought about how this fits into the wider thing that we're trying to teach them. So that's really, really useful. That's the sort of macro level flow. And then within each topic, there's a flow by itself. So here, within number 1, the nature and development, the very first thing we obviously look at is the definition of human rights. That makes a lot of sense. That's the very first thing you need to know. The next thing we look at is the developing recognition of human rights. Again, that just makes a lot of sense. And then the third thing we look at is the formal statements of human rights, which, again, makes a lot of sense. We first look at what human rights are, how they originally came about, and then how they were formally recognized. And what we want to do in terms of making summaries to memorize human rights is take that flow within each part of the macro and make it into sort of a comprehensive summary, which is what you see on the left-hand side. Now, I haven't filled it in entirely, and just a word of a note, I didn't type this up. When I did it, I got an A3 piece of paper. The very first thing I did was divide the piece of paper into 4 columns. And then I started with the developing recognition of human rights. And the reason I did that is because at the time, I knew the definition of human rights backwards. I didn't need to write it down. It was just one of my things that I knew the definitions of certain things like human rights and state sovereignty really, really well. So the very first thing I put down on the left-hand column, I wrote here abolition of slavery. And underneath abolition of slavery, I had the definition of abolition of slavery. I had a case, if there was one. I had a piece of legislation, if there was one. And I had a source, if there was one. But really importantly, I put all of those four things in different colors. So definition was yellow, case, as you saw from my notes, was red, legislation was green, and the source was blue. Same thing with trade unionism, same thing with universal suffrage, etc., 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 all the way around to peace rights. Now, the other thing that I did was I put, as you can see, next to abolition of slavery and peace rights and trade unionism and all of the rest, I put a number. And that number was the number of things that I had underneath abolition of slavery. And I'll explain this in more detail in just one moment. So, for example, under the definition part, I obviously had the definition. Under the case part, I could have had more than one case. And in the case of abolition of slavery, I did. I remember I had one definition, two cases, one legislation, one source, which led to the number 5. There were 5 total things under the abolition of slavery. Now, the reason that this A3 sheet worked so well for me is what I did was I stuck it up on my wall, I stood in front of it, and I just walked through in my mind and out loud each thing, and I made this sort of process in my head, and I was like, okay, the very first thing that happened was the abolition of slavery. What's the definition? What's the cases I have? What's the legislation? What's the source? I'd say it. And then I'd say, okay, and the next thing that happened was trade unionism. What's the definition? What's the cases I have? What's the legislation? What's the source? And I'd walk it through in my mind over and over again. And it really didn't take that long, because even when I couldn't remember the specific, my brain knew what had to come next because of the structure. And this, I hope, clarifies why structure and consistency are so important. So, for example, if I got to trade unionism and I remembered the definition but forgot what was next, half the memorization is unnecessary because I know, because of the structure, that a case has to come next. And just knowing that a case has to come next in the order of things is often a very, very big trigger to bring back the actual name and word and details of the case, right? So this makes it very, very easy to learn. And as you can see, once I got past peace rights, I then filled in the UDHR, the ICCPR, and the ICESCR per the syllabus. Now here, instead of a definition, I had sort of definition/contribution, because the syllabus over here on the right-hand side says examine major human rights documents and explain their contribution to the development of human rights. So under the definition contribution section, I typically had the date it was enacted and maybe a sentence about its contribution, and then hopefully a source underneath that. And the same thing with those. Just by knowing the structure of the information that I had, it would often trigger the information itself. A final note on this sort of way of doing it is that in terms of the definition, I had at max a 7 to 8 word definition. It was really simple. In terms of the case, I had the name of the case and maybe 1 or 2 trigger words for details. I certainly didn't write out an entire case note for each thing. In terms of the legislation, I only had the name of the legislation because I tend to find that legislation names are pretty self-explanatory. In terms of the source, I definitely had the title. If the title was explanatory enough, I left it at that. Sometimes I had, again, 1 or 2 trigger words, but no more than that. It's really just a summary to trigger those specific bits of information. The very final thing I want to say is that when you get into an exam, and let's say you get a question that says, discuss the nature and development of human rights, the very first thing I did was quickly draw up 4 columns on my page, and I didn't fill in any information. All I did was write down the numbers that you see next to each thing. So I'd write 5, 7, whatever it was, all the way down to 3. And this meant that as I was going through my answer, I could tick off and make sure I'd included, or at least remembered to think about, each of the 5 things under abolition of slavery, the 7 things under trade unionism, etc., etc. So it really is the closest thing you can get to having your notes with you in the exam without actually cheating. So I hope you got a lot out of this, and I hope that it sort of clarifies everything that I said earlier on. If not, or if you've got any other questions at all, as always, post them up here or on the Elevate website, and a member of the team will certainly get back to you. Until next time, guys, good luck with everything, and continue watching Elevate Legal.